back in the 18th century, Adam Smith, who was essentially preaching in a more nuanced form than today, but pretty much the same ideas that we preach to the Third World. He advised the American colonies after liberation to follow the proper principles of economic thinking, which are still the proper principles. His advice was that the newly liberated colonies should follow what we now call their comparative advantage. Do what you're good at. So send fish and agricultural products and fur and so on, but don't import superior British goods. That's economically efficient. Anything else would violate the holy principles of economics, which haven't changed much. He also urged the United States not to make the mistake of trying to monopolize its resources, but rather leave them open to the world, meaning primarily England at that time. That's economic realism, the same doctrines preached by the World Bank and the IMF to the Third World. Well, the United States didn't follow the advice. Alexander Hamilton, who ran the economy, ran a state-directed economy. He set up huge, very high tariffs. The U.S. had the highest tariffs in the world during the period of its economic growth, huge economic growth. Keep out cheaper British manufacturers. That's how the U.S. was able to develop a textile industry and everything that spun off the textile industry, its first stage of industrialization. Later, steel industry, same, didn't use superior British steel. What's now called piracy and barred by the World Trade Organization, namely taking superior technology from more advanced countries and using it and adapting it. Very extensive state intervention in the economy. All of this went on right until the Second World War. By that time, the U.S. was far and away the richest country in the world. Everybody else was destroyed. And it was sort of willing to toy with some version of free trade because you figured we're going to win, so let's have free trade. But it didn't end there. In fact, that began the biggest period of state intervention in the economy in the United States, which runs right up till today. And that's the development of high-tech industry. I mean, if you use the internet and computers, lasers, fly on airplanes, that kind of thing, it's most of the work's coming out of the state sector, serious work. So the taxpayer's paying for it, and ultimately, if anything works, it gets privatized. And the fundamental system is that cost and risk are socialized, and profit is privatized, and we call it free markets. But the U.S. didn't follow the advice of the best economists and therefore prospered. There were countries that had to follow that advice because they had not freed themselves from British force. India, Egypt, Britain and France, and others. And that's basically where the division between the First and Third World began to take off. In the 18th century, India and China were the most advanced sectors of the world in industry, commerce, public health, and many other respects. Well, that's with regard to Mexico, the crucial part of Latin America. There was further thinking. So in around 1990, there was a strategy development workshop at the Pentagon evaluating U.S.-Mexico relations. And they found these relations to be, in their words, extraordinarily positive. I mean, not troubled by stolen elections, huge repression, and crushing of the labor movement. All of that was fine. So everything was extraordinarily positive, but they did see a cloud on the horizon. The cloud was what they called a democracy opening in Mexico, which they feared might bring into office a government more interested in challenging the United States on economic and nationalist grounds, violating grand area thinking. And they had a cure. They recommended a U.S., and so did others, a U.S.-Mexican treaty which would lock Mexico in to the neoliberal reforms of the 1980s and would tie the hands of current and future governments of Mexico, because they'd be bound by treaty to keep to this, and that would avert the threat of a democracy opening. Well, there's a name for the outcome of that. It's called NAFTA. That's basically what it is. Other things too, but that's the core purpose, and that was understood. And the same year that Clinton introduced, rammed NAFTA through into implementation over the opposition of the American population, incidentally. But that same year, 1994, Clinton also began to militarize the Mexican-U.S. border. It had been an open border. Like most borders, it was established by force, by conquest, and pretty much the same people lived on both sides of the border, cross the border to visit your relatives and friends and so on. But in 1994, Clinton initiated what was called Operation Gatekeeper to militarize the border, and we don't have internal documents from that period, but if they were to come out, I'm pretty sure what you're going to see is that they understood that they're going to destroy the Mexican economy. Mexican agriculture won't be able to compete with highly subsidized U.S. agribusiness, so peasants will be driven off the farms. U.S. businesses won't be able to compete with U.S.-based multinationals, which under NAFTA have to have the rights of persons, of people, rights of Mexicans, national treatment it's called. If a Mexican comes to the United States, he doesn't get national treatment. If he asks for that, he'll end up in Guantanamo. But if a U.S. corporation goes to Mexico, they have to get national treatment, which means the Mexican businesses won't be able to compete, and you get destruction of that part of the Mexican economy. And so it'll almost inevitably lead to a flow of people fleeing from the wreckage of the Mexican economy, and they'll be joined, in fact already we're being joined by the people fleeing from Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America. So we've got to do something about it. So that's the militarization of the border, which is, of course, still going on. Complicated story. Well, with regard to Latin America altogether, though it was also understood, our control over Latin America was understood to be very critical. Nixon's National Security Council declared in secret, now public, that if we can't control Latin America, how are we going to control the rest of the world? So at least we got to control that. So it was no joke. That was at the moment when they were planning the overthrow of the Allende government in Chile. And the reasoning was very much the same as what the New York Times expressed with regard to Iran in 1953. We have to have an object lesson to countries that go berserk with radical nationalism and challenge our domination of their economies and don't perform the services they're supposed to perform when we've assigned them their function. As Kissinger put it, Chile, if there's a democratic socialist development in Chile, it could be what he called a virus that would spread contagion elsewhere. He thought it would spread contagion all the way to southern Europe. He didn't think that Chilean army was going to land in Rome. He thought that it would be a model that southern European social democrats, in those days called Euro-communist, might want to follow, might inspire them to go on. And therefore you've got to stop it right away. That's a leading principle of international affairs. It's not studied very much, and there isn't any name for it, but it ought to be called the mafia principle. The Godfather does not tolerate disobedience. And if some small storekeeper doesn't pay protection money, maybe the Godfather doesn't need it or won't even notice it, but you can't let them get away with it, no matter how small they are, because it could be a virus that would spread contagion. Others might say, okay, we'll do it too. And if you look over the history of the period since the Second World War, one leading theme is the mafia principle.